going on. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. What I would like to do is just say thank you for joining us this morning and for including me in your conversation. Share maybe 3 topics that are front and center at the Board of Supervisors, and then take questions on any and all topics that relate to our board. So please feel free to be thinking up lots of good questions, because I heard the words 45 minutes and I could see you all collectively slumping in your chairs. So let's not make that happen. I think 3 topics for today, as I mentioned, but first, for those of you who are not aware, people often describe county government as the invisible level of government. I think most people feel like they have some sense of what happens at the state level, or certainly at the national level. I think most folks feel like their local school boards or city councils are front and center, but the county is this sort of place that's off there somewhere. I know folks I talk to, business people in particular, are always a little startled when they say, how big is your budget anyway? And I say, well, it's about $8.1 billion. And they're sort of pinned back in their chairs like, really? There's, somebody spending $8.1 billion of our money, and we don't even know who you are or what you do, or that you exist in some cases, with about 22,000 employees now, and obviously serving all 2 million residents of Santa Clara County, with each one of the 5 county supervisors, myself included, representing about 400,000 people. At the risk of stating the obvious, COVID-19 is front and center, particularly because of the special role that the county's public health department has in managing that challenge. I think it probably would be of interest to some of you to talk a little bit about police reform, law enforcement reform, and efforts that are underway there. And a couple of sort of constant land use issues in my district, in our area, are the Stanford land use matters and the Lehigh cement plant. I will talk a little bit about those, and then, as I say, happy to take questions. On the COVID front, I think I have to say it is unlike anything I have experienced during my many years in public service, and I suspect that it is a similarly unique experience for almost all of you, whoever you are, whatever you do, wherever you do it. At the county, the governance issue, and this is not something that I think most folks would have any reason to give much thought to, but the governing issues are really very complicated and challenging, because folks have been surprised to learn that most of the authority and much of the responsibility for making our way through this is vested in the hands of individual county public health officers, who have always played a very important role in terms of public health, but who, frankly, are unknown to most members of the public and are not themselves elected, of course. So we've got folks showing up at the board virtually these days saying, why don't you 5 supervisors do this, that, or the other? And it's not a terribly satisfactory answer to say, well, because that authority rests with the public health officer and she gets to make the call. But in fact, in California, under California law, that is the case. And early on, I asked, just not because I didn't have high regard for our public health officer, which I do, but I said, look, we need to know our roles and responsibilities. We've got to all make sure we're pulling our weight and doing our part. And so I asked for legal counsel to give us a clear understanding of who had what responsibility. And one of the questions I asked was, may the Board of Supervisors overrule the public health officer on these matters or direct her? And the answer was no. Really, the only person who can sort of step up and say, no, I'm going to overrule you, is the state public health officer. If the state public health officer thinks that our local public health officers at the county level are not doing the job in an appropriate way. Having said all that, there obviously is still a role for the 5 elected members of the Board of Supervisors. As chair of the Health and Hospital Committee, I am particularly obliged to be front and center in that effort. I will tell you that I've chosen sort of 2 areas to focus on in terms of the county's operation. The first is, many of you will remember that the phrase flatten the curve came into our vocabularies for the first time. And the concern was that if we couldn't flatten the curve, meaning hold down the growth of the COVID virus, that our healthcare systems, including our county hospitals, but also local hospitals like the Stanford Hospital or El Camino, would and could very easily be overwhelmed. And so the push to flatten the curve was in part designed to give our healthcare systems the opportunity to surge their capacity, to make sure that they had ample, not just beds, but ICU, intensive care units, the ventilators that I'm guessing many of you read about at the time, and not just the equipment and the personal protective equipment, the PPE that you heard so much about, but also just the staff. If you have a system that is designed to accommodate hundreds of people in the ICU, but suddenly you are confronted with thousands, I think you can see what the scope of the problem could be for folks who are seriously ill. So that flattening the curve effort was important for a whole host of reasons, but one of the areas that I was particularly focused on was making sure that at the county level, where we have 3 hospitals, that our 3 hospitals and others around the county had time to surge their capacity, and did in fact surge their capacity, so that if we had greater and greater numbers, we would be prepared to deal with that when the time came. The other area that's been a particular issue for me and that I've been pushing on, and I think people have now come to understand how important it is the need for readily available testing in sufficient capacities so that we can test across the county. And frankly, this is one where our government let us down. I don't know any other way to say it. You can't make good decisions on a county-wide basis if you don't have good data on a county-wide basis. It's just, you don't need to know a lot about public health to understand that basic notion. And on March the 10th, and I remember the date because it was the last time our Board of Supervisors met in chambers, I asked at the meeting when we talked about these issues, what are we going to do to ramp up testing? And the answer at the time was, well, that's really a federal responsibility, and/or we're going to hope that the private labs that do the testing and that have proprietary systems ramp up their efforts. That didn't seem to me like a very good answer at the time. And I think even the folks who gave that answer at the time would now tell you, no, that has not proved to be a satisfactory answer. So for the last 4 months, I have been pushing on the testing issue, and we have seen dramatic improvement at the county in terms of the tests that we can deliver around the county. And in fact, just a day or 2 ago, we announced in my office a series of regular rotating testing operations here in the North County and West Valley areas that I represent. But we need an all hands on deck on this one, and it's not going to get better anytime soon because the need for testing is going to grow and grow with the passage of time. If we're going to put people back to work safely, we're going to need to be able to test. If grandparents are going to hug their grandkids, we need to be able to make sure that they can test. If we're going to be effective in combating the problem in senior congregate care facilities where probably 40+% of the deaths are taking place, then that means we've got to be regularly on scene, or somebody there has to be ready to do the tests. And again, it's not a one-off. It's something that has to be happening on a recurring basis. So we're going to have to keep pushing on this. We're going to have to try and get our partners in local healthcare systems, whether that's Kaiser, whether that's Sutter and Palo Alto Medical Foundation. A shout out to our friends at El Camino, who, when I approached them, said, absolutely, we want to be helpful, allocated funds to do that. Likewise with folks at Planned Parenthood in Mountain View, who are also providing testing. But we still have a long way to go on this one. Our federal government, frankly, has let us down on this, and the state is struggling and doing the best they can. But I think we just have to accept the fact that we're going to have to do the work here locally. The challenge, of course, and you all, I think, know this intuitively if you don't think of it quite this way, will be for our public health officials to continue to thread the needle. Everyone wants to go back to work right away, but nobody wants to put people in harm's way or risk their health. striking that balance, finding a way to do that as we go forward is the challenge that we're all facing, but most of that rests on the shoulders of our public health officer. Meanwhile, at the county, I have sort of made sure my office and I are mindful of the fact that one of the great challenges that I guess all of us have, is the ever-changing and sometimes contradictory information we get about what are the rules, what can we do, what can we not do, how can we get back to work, wait a minute, we can't, open on Monday, closed on Wednesday. I was on the phone with, I think it was Kim and Jeannie Bruins, when the alcoholic beverage control officers with their sidearms went restaurant hopping down in South County. So my office and I are focused on trying to be a resource for people, making sure we provide information, handle the flood of phone calls and emails that has come into my office. And of course, like all of you, we're trying to do our work under the adverse consequences of a shelter-in-place order and now a risk mitigation order. Also, telephone town halls, I have been amazed at how well received those have been. Literally thousands of people on the telephone town halls, which I've been trying to do about once a month these days, is to make sure that there's someone who is knowledgeable and authoritative who can just give good answers so people can plan their lives. But for all of us who are looking for a greater certainty, I wish I could give it to you, but it's not there. The virus will call the shots until we get the virus under control. And, the answer to many of the questions we get is, frankly, it's complicated or it depends. And I know neither of those are particularly satisfactory answers. But meanwhile, we've got to do what we can here in our county to bring the transmission rate down. And that's a challenge because we're just one of 58 counties and people move freely across county boundaries. And so even if we're doing a hell of a job here in Santa Clara County, all it takes is folks coming into work from the Central Valley where they've got a real struggle, or from San Mateo County right next door where they've been a little bit more open, I think, with unfortunate consequences. But folks, this is going to be with us for a while. I think that message is getting out there. But if I were to look at Sally's face here on the screen, or Kim, or whoever I'm happen to be glancing at, I would say, we're going to be wearing masks come December. Don't that's the hard truth of it. And to me, that's sort of the way to assess how challenging this is. So please let me and my office know if we can be helpful, if there are specific issues or questions, certainly about business. I have just been in touch with the chamber as well as other chambers in my district. And sometime later this month, we're going to start a monthly or twice monthly Zoom meeting specifically for businesses in my district, with someone from our legal counsel's office on the Zoom meeting with me to get good answers. And I found that format works pretty well, because the person who's there who knows all the answers will have the answers for you. And then I'll be there to say, gee, I'm not sure that was a really full answer. I wonder if we could get a little more information about that. That model seems to work pretty well. And we're thinking, based on the conversations with the chamber and others, maybe once a month on a sort of a general basis, and then another Zoom meeting during the same month that is sector specific. Maybe it's hospitality industry, maybe it's construction industry, maybe it's restaurant, whatever. But I think the need for local businesses to understand what the lay of the land is, what the rules of the road are, is going to be there for the foreseeable future. So why don't I stop there? We can certainly come back to COVID, but I want to also mention in the aftermath of the police reform efforts, in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing in a couple months back now, the issue of police reform surfaced yet again on our agenda. I should tell you, it's an issue that I have been working on for some time, relatively quietly, at the Board of Supervisors. when I'm sure many of you, if I just say the name Ferguson, will have a memory in the not too distant past of when that was front and center. And, at the time, after that tragedy in Ferguson and a lost life at the hands of police and the controversy that surrounded it, I couldn't help but notice that there was anger, there was grief, there were protests, and all of that is as it should be. But, the real question, it seems to me, in moments like that is, so what are you going to do about it? And I talked to folks in the community whose experience and judgment I thought would be helpful. People in the law enforcement world, people in the social justice world, people in academic arenas. And I came to the conclusion, this back late 2014, that there were three things that were very specific, very tangible that we could and should do at Santa Clara County, where we have a somewhat different challenge because we have an independently elected sheriff. So unlike local police chiefs who report up through the city council and the city manager, our county structure involves a local sheriff who is independently elected and has authority unto herself. But the three things that I thought we could and should do were get body-worn cameras in place, which we did not have at the time. And for those of you who aren't familiar with body-worn cameras, they're not a panacea, but they have some benefits, which is, by definition, if you have the body-worn camera and it's on, and that's another topic, then there's a measure of accountability that otherwise doesn't exist. Experience in other communities had demonstrated to my satisfaction that it actually did reduce use of force. And it also reduced the number of claims, frankly, that as taxpayers you all should be concerned about, because somebody who was going to file a bogus claim against the county no longer had the ability to make up a story and put that forward as a basis for compensation if the body worn showed that the officer had in fact acted in an appropriate way. That was all to the good. But we went from having a handful of folks with body warrants to essentially having virtually everybody in the county's law enforcement, both in the jails and out in the community enforcement patrols, with body-worn cameras. And I thought that was an important first step in both accountability and trust building, but also in reducing use of force. The second piece of it was something called implicit bias training. And some of you may know we've got some really talented folks, knowledgeable folks right here at Stanford University who've done a lot of work in this. And implicit bias training is essentially an additional measure of training for folks in law enforcement to help them understand the implicit biases that we all carry with us as we go through our daily lives. And more importantly, as part of understanding it, knowing how to manage it so that it doesn't get out of control in a way that can have life or death consequences. So the first step was body-worn cameras. The second step was implicit bias training, which now, again, virtually all of the county's correctional and enforcement officers go through, the deputies. And the third and final step, which proved to be a bigger lift than I thought it would, was civilian oversight. And this is, as you can imagine, a source of tension. And it's a healthy tension, or it can be a healthy tension. It should be a healthy tension, because you want to remember that your law enforcement is a civilian law enforcement body, keeps us safe, valued, important, essential, but that it requires meaningful civilian oversight. And I authored and working with colleagues, obviously, a civilian oversight ordinance for our county so that we would have an official monitor for law enforcement in our county. We talked about whether we wanted to try and build that into our county offices as a sort of a standalone operation or contract out. Ultimately, a majority of the board said, let's contract with an experienced provider. We have done that. They're called the OIR Group. While they are based in Southern California, they have Northern California experience, including right next door in Palo Alto. And they are now on board as of earlier this year to provide the oversight and policy direction on law enforcement issues, so that even as we are recognizing the independent authority of the sheriff for her operation, there is a mechanism to make sure that there's someone who's casting a watchful eye and trying to ensure that all of that work gets done in a way that's appropriate with people's civil liberties. All of that was before the tragedy in Minneapolis with George Floyd, where, I think any of us who saw that killing on tape could not help but be moved, but also, frankly, shake our heads and say, how often do we have to look at this? How many times are we going to see this? When are we going to step up and do more? And again, my view at the board was that while there were resolutions to be passed and expressions of concern, for me it's always like, yeah, but what are you going to do about it? What are the tangible next steps to make sure that we don't have a situation like this here in Santa Clara County if it can be possibly avoided? And so what I put forward was a package of reforms, and just to do them briefly, essentially there was something called 8 Can't Wait, which I'm guessing some of you may have heard about or read about in the immediate aftermath of the Minneapolis killing. I thought most of those items were pretty common sense. Again, I did my due diligence talking with folks quietly behind the scenes, both in the social justice community, law enforcement, academia, and that was sort of part one. These are all measures that are designed to address inappropriate or excessive use of force. I then offered up what I'd call sort of a second package of 5 items that were designed to address wider ranging issues, including hiring practices. There's a challenge that we have in law enforcement when there are interdepartmental transfers, and this is sometimes referred to as the dance of the lemons, also known as the turkey trot, when bad officers go from one department to another without sufficient diligence, and concerns about the over-militarization of law enforcement, which is, after all, supposed to be a civilian enterprise for all of us. Concern about some of the crowd control devices that have been used, thinking of what we used to call non-lethal and now we refer to as less lethal means of control, talking about things like rubber bullets, flashbangs, pepper gas. These are all things that can have deadly effect, even though they're not intended to, and pretty serious effects. So, as I say, in addition to the 8 Can't Wait, another package of 5 items that I've asked our county and the sheriff to look at. And then finally, we do have some new state law that has just come down, some of which is not even effective yet, will be effective at the end of the year. And so I asked for an audit just to make sure that the policies and procedures we had in place were consistent with existing law. Much of that work will happen off in one of our committees, the Public Safety and Justice Committee, on which I do not sit, but the chair is our relatively new colleague, Susan Ellenberg. She is quite serious about these issues as well, quite committed. And I'm optimistic that between her work on the committee with the referral that our board passed at my request 5-0, and the presence now of an independent monitor who can provide some real expertise in this conversation, that we can make progress. It will ultimately require some cooperation and collaboration from the sheriff as an independently elected official, and that's part of the challenge as well. So we can talk more about that if you like, but I just, as I said, when there are these moments of sort of national crisis, I always go to, all right, what's the tangible thing we can do? It's not that the expression of grief or anger or frustration or protest isn't appropriate or called for, but my view is that it's got to lead to something that's lasting, and my hope is that this work will. Finally, it wouldn't be a conversation about the 5th Supervisorial District in which you reside or work and which I represent if we didn't have some land use challenges to discuss. Been a few months now, but some of you will recall that for close to 3 years, the county was engaged in an ongoing process with Stanford University, who had asked for development approvals for about 3.5 million square feet of academic use facilities there, including 2,600 student beds. plus another 550 housing units. These are always, frankly, difficult challenges at the county because our county has a long-standing policy of guiding development, significant development, into the incorporated communities where there are land use plans for significant development, where there is infrastructure for significant development. So most of the development work that the county processes is relatively small, frankly. You know, a 4-lot subdivision down in San Martin. If we have something that's 100,000 square feet, people think that's huge. And then, as it happens, every 20 years or so, we suddenly are confronted with the need to deal with an application from somebody like a Stanford University, whose 3.5 million square feet application was the largest ever processed in the history of the county. So it's just, it's just hard when you're not set up for that on a regular basis, as any of you would know from your lives or your work. All of a sudden, you've got this new challenge. I thought it took a little time, frankly, but ultimately I thought the county stood up a good operation. We had widespread engagement from communities around the Mid-Peninsula who could weigh in, express their interests and concern. And then literally 4 days before the item was to have been heard for tentative approval by the Board of Supervisors, the university withdrew its application. And that, I think, startled many people. I can't pretend to know all the inside thinking at the university, but I do think that the fact that we had stayed focused on the expectation of full mitigation for any adverse impacts was something that perhaps the university had not anticipated. And I would also say the university had, as some of you will recall, been pushing for what's known as a development agreement, which we had never used in the 170-year history of the county, but we're open to. In fact, I made the motion to say, let's consider it. But as we had those conversations, and they were relatively modest, it became increasingly clear that what the university hoped to acquire through a development agreement was essentially a waiver of county roles and responsibilities during the 20-year life of the general use permit. So, fees that would remain constant or adjusted only at a certain rate over 20 years, regardless of the need for the fee revenue. Zoning and general plan land use designations that would remain fixed over the 20 years, essentially surrendering the zoning authority, the land use authority of the county. The issue of full mitigation, though, is one that I think we're going to be confronting in all of our communities. Historically, and I know you all know this, the CEQA process, the California Environmental Quality Act, says, well, let's go out and identify the impacts and let's make sure they get mitigated. And, sometimes, frankly, people just are not rigorous about that. Sometimes, as some of you know who've been through the process, local governments think that's their opportunity to say, stick them up. Here's what we want if you want an approval. And I'm not good with either of those. I really do believe it's pretty straightforward. Hard, but pretty straightforward. Identify what the adverse impacts are going to be and expect the developer applicant to mitigate those impacts. Because you really have only three choices. Either the applicant, in this case Stanford University, mitigates the adverse impacts of their development, or the cost of mitigating those impacts falls on the surrounding community and taxpayers and businesses, by the way, or they don't get mitigated. So you can either let things get worse, push the cost on somebody else, or expect the applicant to fully mitigate the cost, whether it's traffic, transportation, whether it's housing. And, I will just say for you, trying to run a business and hire people and hire people and pay an affordable wage for you and a livable wage for them, given our housing costs, I kept trying to make the case through this process that if we didn't get full mitigation on the housing front, that all that would do was make our existing housing crisis worse, make the scarcity worse, push the cost of both rental and purchase homes up. And all of that was then going to make it harder for local businesses who I represent to hire the people they need to do the work that has to get done to make your local businesses thrive. So I saw this as not simply a quality of life issue, but as an economic viability issue for many of the folks in the surrounding area. Same with the traffic issues, and we had some unique school funding issues because of the circumstances. Certainly open space was an issue, but long story long, I think the conversation was an important one for our region to have about, all right, what are our expectations of folks who develop in the area? And, I kept myself open to approval of all 3.5 million square feet all the way through the process, as long as there was full mitigation. And, I had some folks who said, well, aren't you being a little tough on the university? And I said, you need to realize that in the 170-year history of the county, Stanford has never had an application turned down. And during my 2 tenures on the board, both in the late 90s when we did this recently, I have cast an aye vote and most of the time been the maker of the motion on every application that Stanford has had before our Board of Supervisors. That being said, when it comes time to talk about 3.5 million square feet and the impact on traffic, housing, education, open space, I think you got to be rigorous about your expectations, and that's where we are. Where things go from here is anybody's guess. Stanford has authority under a prior general use permit from the year 2000 to build a few 100,000 square feet more. They'll continue to use that authority to build, and we'll see what their thinking is once they've regrouped and come back. Who knows? I think people's thinking about what kind of space they need and how much of it may well change as a result of the pandemic experience. We'll see. Meanwhile, as if that weren't enough to keep us busy, the folks over at Lehigh Cement Plant and Quarry have come to the county and said, hey, guess what? We pretty much have played out the existing pit that is there, which means we need a permit for a new pit. And that has been a source of concern to folks in the community. Stanford matters tend to be mostly Palo Alto centered. Lehigh matters tend to be mostly Cupertino centered. But whenever Lehigh issues come up, I'll also hear from folks in surrounding communities, including Los Altos and Los Altos Hills, just as whenever Stanford issues come up, I hear from folks in the wider region. For those of you who have not ever followed it, I would encourage you to take 2 minutes and just Google Lehigh Cement Plant Quarry, go to images, and you'll go, oh my God, I didn't know that was there. It's one of those issues that if it doesn't affect you, then it's probably not even a passing thought. If it does affect you, whether it's concern about truck traffic or water quality or air quality or visual impacts, it's a very big deal. Here again, a challenge for our county, given the fact that we typically do smaller projects, and that this also involves mining regulation. And trust me, Gay Krause, I'm looking at you because I can see you on the screen. You don't want to learn anything about mining law, okay? It's just painful, but it's its own obscure world, and it's an overlay on all of the sort of routine land use regulatory authority that's in place in California, and it makes that all the more challenging, I would say. But these two big land use issues are going to be with me for as long as I'm on the Board of Supervisors. I knew that the day I came back on the board in 2013 and told my office, issues will come and go, but Stanford and Lehigh will be with us on day one, and they will be with us the day we walk out the door, and it's our job to make sure that they get managed fairly but responsibly. Why don't I stop there? You've been a very patient group, at least I don't see anybody nodding off yet. So why don't we stop there, take questions on any and all topics. And again, thank you for including me. And I really do look forward to having a little bit more of an exchange now that I've stopped pontificating.
Thank you, Joe. That was a lot of information in 40 minutes, 35 minutes. Raise your hand if you have a question. I'll start it off. Joe, we've seen information about testing, COVID testing in Los Altos Hills, Mountain View. I understand it's moved to a appointment-based system rather than standing in line for 2.5 hours. Has that been tried elsewhere, and does it work?
It does. You sort of helped me by answering the question with the reference to the 2.5. People said, well, why are we going to an appointment-based system? Doing a drop-in seems a whole lot more convenient. And I said, well, it's a whole lot more convenient as long as you've got 2.5 hours to stand in line, which is what happens when on an unscheduled basis, large numbers of folks just happen to show up at a time that is convenient for everyone. So the hope is that we can avoid people standing in line for long periods of time. Also, it should be quicker just across the board in terms of the process for anyone who goes for a test, because there's a certain amount of, all of us have been through this when we visit the doctor's office, a certain amount of just basic routine information that has to be collected: name, contact information, address, other personal information. But when an appointment is done online, that information can be collected individually ahead of time, so that the time that is at the testing site isn't used up doing what is essentially sort of a routine clerical function. That means that we can provide even more testing at the site, because it's all about the testing and not about collecting the information. And it also means that for folks who have shown up for a test, that it should be a quicker process. Never mind the no wait part, it should be a quicker process because they're not sitting there answering a bunch of questions which they could have done from the comfort of their own home when filling out the application. So the appointment system is designed to mean less potential for lines, less time actually taking the test, the ability to provide more tests as well. And yes, it has been used effectively in other venues. When we did the first round of testing in the North County, as you will recall, it was sort of a pilot or a trial basis. There was a lot learned from that. One of the things that I pushed strongly on, and I appreciated the county staff hearing it, was, look, it's great that we provide the testing, but we've got to make sure that people can plan ahead a little bit. Announcing on Monday, hey, we've got tests Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Well, that's great if you get the word and it happens to work. One of the benefits of this new program, as I think you already know, Dennis, is that we've picked, 1 or 2 days a month in each of the, North County and West Valley cities that I represent, so that people can say, oh, here's the schedule, here's a date and time that works for me. By virtue of having an appointment, they can be assured of their appointment relatively close to that time. So I think it'll bring some certainty and ability for people to plan, which is an added benefit. Last thing I should say is I have been pushing, and some of you have perhaps seen it, and there's a little friction there, and that's okay. But I've been pushing on our health and hospital systems to step up their testing regimen. And there are challenges. I don't deny that for a minute. But what I've said is, look, the county has been pooling tests, meaning doing a batch together. That's my virtual PowerPoint, forgive me. Doing a batch of tests together is a way to multiply testing capacity. You can run 5 tests at a time. Stanford's now doing 8 tests at a time. We've been doing this for a few months now. And so, I've been pushing on folks to hustle it up and find ways to pool tests in other systems. So it's not just the county's public hospitals that are pooling. The folks over at Kaiser in the East Bay, as some of you read, spent some time to ramp up their capacity and get a lab capacity. And to which I have said, thank you so much, and please do it again, because we're still not getting the level of testing from our local healthcare providers that we need. Some of them have not taken well to that gentle encouragement from me. I understand the sensitivity there, but if we're going to say we're all in this together, then we really have to all be in it together. I can't look at Kathy on the screen or Abby, who's next to her on my screen, and say, well, we're all in this together, except you don't have to do your part. Or, we want you as business to do this, but we as the county aren't responsible. No, we're all in this together means we're all in this together. And that means that as hard pressed as they may feel they are, as much as they may feel they've been doing, everybody's got to step it up when it comes to testing. And, I've heard people say, well, gee, we're having trouble getting the swabs, to which I would say two things. First, this country fought and won a world war on 2 continents in 3.5 years. Are you telling me we can't make some swabs? I mean, really? And to the healthcare professionals, I very specifically say, for God's sakes, you can do a quadruple bypass, but you can't make a cotton swab. Let's figure it out. We can't take it. Look, it is what it is as an answer. All of you who are entrepreneurs know that being entrepreneurial means creating new solutions to challenges or problems that haven't been addressed before. That's what it means to be entrepreneurial. So we've all got to be entrepreneurial, whether we're in the healthcare arena or whether we're in the business community or whether we're in government. I pushed from day one on county staff to step it up, and to their credit, they have. Took longer than I had hoped it would, but they have. And we got to have that testing, and we're gonna need it even more. If you're in the hospitality industry, you need to be able to test your folks and know when they come to work that they are virus free. And you need to be able to then tell your clients, our folks have been tested and they're virus free. And, the need is only going to get greater. So thank you, Dennis. Sorry, you got me on a roll there. I apologize, but
Well, I'm going to put Anthony on the spot. Do you have the dates in front of you for Los Altos Hills, Anthony? Unmute yourself.
Kim looks like she's excited to see the date.
Kim, do you have the dates?
I have it.
Okay.
I was actually going to interject there. So the next date is actually tomorrow in Los Altos Hills. So the newsletter that we sent yesterday at around 3:20, if you need a copy of that, the link is provided in that newsletter, or follow up with us after the meeting, and we can make sure that you have access to register for a time slot if they're still available tomorrow. Can I ask a piggyback question while I have the floor? Supervisor Simitian, in saying
Jim, it's Joe. Thank you. It's Joe. It's Joe.
Thank you, Joe. In saying that we're all in this together, I'm talking about, what are we asking of our tech community, the big key players, the Google, the Apple, Facebook? I've been really disappointed personally to see a lack of action in the last 4 months in really stepping up to support us through this crisis, not just locally, but even in a global fashion.
I think there have been some significant contributions towards the relief programs that have been administered by both the county and by public agencies, including our Silicon Valley Community Foundation right here locally. At the risk of stating the obvious, the need has outstripped even the very generous contributions that have been made. We're talking about several $1 million. Our county has funded some of that relief with public funds, taxpayer dollars, and then use those dollars to leverage contributions from private donors, including large tech companies and other philanthropists. But I think we are only now, well, that's perhaps an overstatement. I think it has taken a while for the full fiscal impact to be felt and understood. And I don't think it's the end. So duly noted, the need will continue. In fact, it seems to be growing greater and greater. And the need for local industries to step up will be greater and greater. And this is one of the challenges, Los Altos, a relatively small town. I mean, you're an interesting chamber because you're in one of the most sophisticated communities in the country. But, a relatively small town and with a lot of smaller business interests. And, for those of you who have brick and mortar presence in the community, your roots in the community are pretty clearly established. For our larger corporations, where both talent and capital are now global and move, those connections are not strong the way they once were. When I grew up as a kid in Palo Alto, I had a local group I worked with that was struggling for funds. And so I literally went to the shelf at Palo Alto High School, pulled down the student directory, called Bill Hewlett of Hewlett Packard at HP using his home phone number from the directory on the shelf, and asked for a couple $100 for the group I was associated with. And he said, sure, come by the plant on Wednesday. Bob will have a check for you at the front desk. So I went by and there was the check for $200, $300. At the risk of stating the obvious, the world has changed. But we do need to make sure that those who are part of the local community step up, as I know many of you have done in various ways, and thank you for that.
I see some hands up. Sally Meadows, and then Gay Kraus.
Thank you.
All right. Good morning. Thank you, Supervisor Simitian. Another COVID question. So we're talking a lot about the testing and the cases, but I hear that we now have a state reporting issue, and Dr. Cody was showing a chart saying that we could have decreasing cases, plateau cases, increasing. We don't really know right now. So I don't quite understand where that problem came from in the last week or so, it looked like from the chart. But also, are people getting correct individual results, but we're not compiling them correctly on the county or state level? Or are people not even necessarily getting their individual results right now?
Oh, the problem that exists does not affect individual results. I should start there. So while there are such things as false positives and false negatives, the glitch that has been identified is a systems glitch with the state system. The state system, as some of you may have read the term, CalReady is the state system for processing all this data. It was frankly not robust enough to handle the demands of COVID, so they upgraded it with some additional improvements. And when that happened, that may or may not be the source. That's the current speculation, though, of the problem. And this is a problem at the state level with the state system. The problem is that the people who conduct the tests and who send the information about the test results collectively send it to the state, and then the state sends it back to the local counties on a county-by-county basis. So, I wish I could tell you that it was a state problem and we don't have to worry about it, but it is a state problem that adversely affects our ability to get good information. Now, we have some indicators that are local, that are ones we can look at. For example, the number of deaths, well, that's a number we know locally. The number of folks in our hospitals, that's a number we know locally. The numbers that we get back from our own county testing being done by Santa Clara County, we have our own numbers. We send them off to the state and they put them together with the numbers from other hospitals or providers. But if we can look at our own numbers and have some sense of what's happening from that. But we really don't have good numbers from the state right now on a county-wide basis from all of the testing providers. And that's a source of concern because you can't make good judgments about what is and isn't appropriate if you don't have good numbers for the entire county.
Okay, Gay Kraus. Gay,
go ahead.
You had a question?
Yeah, hi, Joe. Yeah, my question is more about about getting the results, because I keep hearing from the COVID testing that places around the world are getting results back like in 90 minutes, 60 minutes, and things, and yet that's not really happening here locally. And if we want the tests to be reliable, as I understand it from some of the people I know in the medical field, they're telling me you almost need to test people daily. Your test result that came back negative is great for today, but tomorrow it might be a different thing, or 2 days from now. So so especially our local businesses and people that are really interacting with the public, they need to get tested really often. But it doesn't do any good if they don't get back the results for 5 days.
Yes.
How are we addressing that issue? Or, I mean, I'm curious about how these other places around the world seem to be getting the results back so fast, and then our area, we're not able to get the results back.
I would say yes to all of the things you said. I would say that the issue of prompt turnaround is also important because when you get a positive case, the first thing you want to do is make sure that that person goes into isolation and doesn't spread the virus,
Right.
and that you can identify their contacts and get to the contacts and say to the half dozen people that they were in touch with, hey, you've been exposed. We need to talk to you about a quarantine so that they don't spread it to others. Obviously, if you wait 3 days, 5 days, 7 days to get to that person, you've got a bunch of folks out there potentially spreading the virus. So it's important in terms of the control to do that. In terms of the whys, part of the answer is that the lab capacity has been overwhelmed in many venues, which is why I say that, you know, among all of the challenges, we have to find a way to expand the lab capacity. And that's one of the benefits of pooling, is that if you can do 5 in a batch, as we've been doing at the county, or 8 in a batch, as I understand Stanford is now doing, then by definition, you're moving through more tests more quickly. That, I think, holds the promise of a more timely response. But then as that's happening, we also need to just see more lab capacity developed. None of the counties in my observation have ever had the capacity to do other than a modest amount of lab work, because it's for their hospital. It hasn't been designed for a pandemic, and most of the testing, as I said, is proprietary with private labs, which limits our ability. We're further constrained by the fact that a lot of the capacity is apparently being commandeered at the federal level. So there you go.
Okay, we're down to our last 5
Okay,
minutes.
thank
So
you.
Dennis Sema and then Rhoda Fry.
Thanks. Hi,
Dennis, you
Joe.
got a question?
I do, although it's not a 30-second question, but Joe, I'm going to assume, as with every other public entity, that the economic downturn is going to affect the public treasury at the county in some way. And it's probably the worst time to do that in the middle of a pandemic. Just wondering what's on your radar screen. Is it perhaps not this year, but next year when chickens come to roost for the county to
No,
look over?
I'm going to do this one quickly. We adopted what was essentially a placeholder budget in June to conform with California law, but our real budget for this year is going to be adopted this month in August, and that's when we will have to confront some of the immediate impacts, which are estimated to be at least $300 million, if not $500 million, for our county. To address that, some of you may have read in the paper, a couple of my colleagues, Supervisor Chavez and Cortese, put forward a 5/8 cent sales tax measure and wanted to impose a countywide sales tax measure. And it required 4 votes to go on the ballot, and then would have required a simple majority to pass. It was a general tax. The measure got a 3-2 vote at the Board of Supervisors. Supervisor Chavez, Cortese, and Ellenberg voting aye. My colleague Mike Wasserman and I voted no. My argument was and remains that passing a regressive sales tax in the midst of a recession is not a good idea, either in terms of its impact on the public generally or on our economy, particularly given the fact that Santa Clara County already has one of the highest, if not the highest, sales tax in the Bay Area. I just thought that was a bridge too far, and particularly given the fact that we're looking at a split roll tax measure on the ballot, 1/8 cent sales tax measure for Caltrain, and that our Board of Supervisors approved making our own 1/8 cent sales tax permanent just a couple of years ago. I couldn't get there. Will it mean difficult cuts? Yes. But our Board of Supervisors has approved budgets that grew by 84% in the last 7 years. Now, I voted for all of them, so I'm not saying that critically. But when population grows by 6% and inflation grows by 21%, and your budget grows by 84%, going to the public and saying, we can't cut 3 or 4%, and therefore we want to add another tax, I just thought that was not a case we could make. And I'm guessing Rhoda wants to talk about the Lehigh, so I'll try and give a quick question there. And actually, there's a little bit of news to share, so let's make sure we don't leave her out of the last question, Dennis.
Let's go to Rhoda.
Supervisor. And I'm wearing a Deborah Burke's scarf in recognition of COVID. And you know, the quarry is by far closer to Los Altos Hills and Los Altos than it is to Cupertino. In 1992, the quarry actually proposed to build housing when the quarry ran out of material. So this expansion plan is a surprise. Now, I've got a whole array of concerns. Yesterday, I got a call from a prospective client who wanted to build a new home in Los Altos Hills overlooking Rancho San Antonio. So I'm also an owner of the William H. Fry Construction Company. So we build new homes, additions, and remodels in the area, and I'm a member of the chamber. So I cautioned him that the quarry has an ambitious plan to remove 50 feet or so from the protected ridge line between the quarry and Rancho San Antonio, using about 1,100 tons of explosives per year, along with increasing heights of the 200+ acre waste rock area that you can see as a brown line from the valley floor when you look up at the hillside. Additionally, they plan to convert the quarry into a dump site, adding over 600 trips daily for 30 or so years. That would also impact the residents of Los Altos and Los Altos Hills and surrounding areas and Palo Alto. So we're looking at major impacts. There's also major health impacts because the cement plant is responsible for 12.7% of California's industrial sulfur pollution and a major contributor to nitrogen pollution. Both
And the question is, Rhoda.
Yeah,
Rhoda?
we're running out. Thank you, Rhoda.
Property values.
Question?
And the other question, specifically, the county, thank you very much, has recently discovered a major landslide that's threatening Permanente Creek. I'm very worried that there's not insufficient face money from Heidelberg Cement, which is in financial straits to clean
You
up.
have a question, Rhoda?
Yeah, I just said to talk about the fate. So I'm really worried about the property value issues. So that's a concern. The question is specifically regarding to make sure when can the county work on getting an updated financial assurance cost estimate, because we cannot afford to be holding the bag if that landslide goes into Permanente Creek, which was recently discovered. And really take a new view of the entire quarry property, because they just do an incremental financial look at it annually.
Here's three quick responses, because I want to respect everybody's time. On the financial assurances issue, I'll have to get back to you. I've got staff on the call with me, so let me get back to you on that piece. We have in our own office audited the quarry in the past for compliance with conditions of approval. There was a small $75,000 performance bond that was not in place, that was required, and that's now in place, but it does require, as I say, that we continue to be sort of vigilant at the county about providing that oversight. The second thing I would say is that while people are understandably and appropriately engaged early on this issue because of the size of the proposed development, this is a matter that's going to be literally years in the making. We've got an application now that's been deemed complete, as I know you know, but the process on this is not 3 months, 6 months, a year. We'll be on this one for some time, and there'll be a lot of opportunity for people to raise questions, comment on the EIR, so on and so forth. The most important thing I should share, though, is that prior to my return to the board, back prior to 2013, previous boards made a couple of decisions about both what the reclamation plan for the quarry should be, and also about what the vested rights on the property were for the mining and cement plant operation. And that sounds a little jargonistic, but in plain English, what it means is there was a determination about, all right, what are you entitled to do as a matter of right, because you were here long before we started imposing land use issues, and what is it you do need to come and get specific approval or permission from the county on. And for Rhoda, who I know has an interest in this topic, but for all of you, if you have an interest, literally within the last 24, 48 hours, the county planning department has issued a lengthy document, maybe 12 pages long. I have not yet had a chance to read it myself. that says, here is the answer to your question about what is vested and what is not, Supervisor Simitian and fellow board members. And when you have the answer to that question about what is vested and what is not, then you suddenly have a better understanding. All right, what is the nature and intensity of use that is allowed by right? And what are the nature or intensity of uses that would require someone to get further permission? And that is a key question before we can get to these other larger questions going forward that Rhoda has raised. So stay tuned.
Thank you. We are
Can we
over
get a hold
time.
of that document, Supervisor
It-
Simitian?
It should be available on the county's planning department's webpage, and I know you know how to access that. But if it is not, just shoot a copy or an email rather to Christina Loquist in my office, who I know you're in touch with. She'll send you a copy of the document, and it's
Thank you.
12 pages, although I think the last number of pages are essentially footnotes and appendices. Okay.
Thank you. We are over time, and I'm going to cut it off there, except to turn it over to Kim Mosley to wrap it up.
Thank you, Dennis. I do have one question that I must ask before we close, if that's okay, if in reference to the social justice reform.
You're in charge.
Thank you. Joey, so you'd mentioned the proposals that you'd put forth and things that you've done in the past. I'm wondering which of those actually would apply as requirements for our municipalities as well. So for example, the body cam requirements would be implemented by the sheriff's department, I'm assuming, but would they also apply to our local municipalities, or is there a way that that can be done for efficiency's sake for county?
No, they do not apply to local municipalities because each of the 15 cities and towns has their own authority as to how they regulate the police powers. Now, sometimes local departments will use county standards or a county model ordinance as a way to shortcut adoption themselves. They can say, well, here's what we did. But the situation, as I referenced with a county sheriff, is a unique one because there's actually a specific section of the California Government Code that talks about the limitations of a Board of Supervisors' authority and also our responsibility, nonetheless, to deal with some of these issues. But a sheriff is always going to exercise his or her authority as an independently elected official. That is not the case with a police chief in a city or town where there is this other matter. But when we adopt something, it will be for our, and as we have, it's for our organization. It does not apply and cannot apply to the other 15 cities and towns that are governmental jurisdictions unto themselves.
Okay.
Thank
We
you.
just need to encourage our localities to follow your lead. Great. So let me just kind of run through a few things here in announcements. Again, the newsletter that was sent yesterday is a great resource for you to follow up on all of these. But I don't know if you have heard about the Small Business Relief Fund that the Chamber worked with Los Altos Community Foundation and the City of Los Altos to create. We were successful in that and able to fund 75 of our small businesses with $5,000 grants, infusing $375,000 back into our community. So I just wanted to give a shout out for that and thank you all for your support of that effort. We have a chamber raffle that we are implementing. We're just starting out and accepting donations from our businesses, so be on the lookout for that as well. I wanted to acknowledge that the chamber does an endorsement process for candidates for city council. Sally Meadows is a candidate that's on our call here this morning. I don't believe I saw any other candidates, but stay tuned for our endorsement process, and just wanted to recognize Sally on this call. And then other sessions, the testing, as we mentioned, is tomorrow in Los Altos Hills for COVID testing. We have a race, gender, and inclusiveness panel and workshop on the 13th. Distance learning seminar with one of our chamber member experts. That's on August 18th. And Oscar is leading a Grow Your Business with the Chamber session tomorrow as well. So that's just a bit of an overview of what we've been up to, but please take a look at that and support our businesses in Los Altos this weekend through Open Streets.
Okay, lastly, I want to thank you, Joe, again for participating. It was one of the most robust conversations we've had. We have gone 10 minutes over time. So I will thank all 30 participants, which is a unusually large number. So you are an attraction, my friend. And thank you all for being here, and we're over. We're done.
Thanks again, gang. Stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.